In this video, you're going to learn how to punish these early bishop moves where they pin your knight to the queen. I'll run you through some of the basic techniques, and then we'll watch a game of Magnus. You'll see exactly one of the techniques we talk about, and you'll see the middle game plans and how he converts his advantage. Before we learn how to punish these moves, first I'll quickly show you a few ways to survive, because I know the pressure that pin exerts can be very difficult to withstand. So in this position, it's an exchange Caro-Kann. Our bishop is defending that square, which this bishop would love to go to. So the only real square the bishop wants to go to is that pin square. And we're just not going to let them. Just play h3. Unless you're a really solid, like 2000 plus rated chess player, it's going to be very difficult for black to punish these early pawn moves. So if you hate the bishop moves that much, don't worry too much about playing h3. If you do get pinned, and you're not going to use some of the techniques you see later, there's a few things you can do. Again, this won't get you an advantage, but you can always drop your bishop back. It's not the end of the world. And you can always support your knight like this, linking them together. And that's just a few simple ways that you can survive and not just get crushed and lose straight out of the opening. Moving on to punishing these pins, you'll see them most in the Scandinavian defense. We'll look at e4, e5 later, but at the moment, in this line, you want to take, they'll take back with the queen. You attack the queen with tempo, they drop the queen back, and then if you develop your knight, here comes the bishop. So if you want to punish these pins, one way is to develop your bishop to c4. So a few important tactical things to note in the position is this bishop is staring at this f7 pawn, which is very weak, and even though our knight is pinned to because the queen's behind it, this bishop is also getting stared at, and the pin goes both ways. So for example, if they just develop their knight, say to c6, we immediately have this bishop sacrifice, because if they take, this two-way pin comes into effect because we can jump the knight forward, exposing an attack on the bishop. And if the king just retreats, we're up a pawn, the king can't castle, and you have a great position. So that's one way. But even if they defend the bishop, in this situation, you can actually sacrifice your queen. Now, this happens in a few different situations because basically, if they take the queen, that's just checkmate. So it happens in the Scandinavian. There's a nice line with the Black-Mar-Dima gambit where this is really popular. So this is a great checkmate pattern to know. But even not, you're attacking this bishop now twice and you're threatening that pawn. So this is great. Black's best move is to retreat the bishop. And then you trade on this and you can see you're doing great as white. So tactically, that bishop c4 move is a great way to punish that pin. Moving on to our next technique. In this match, you can see it's an Italian game. We have e4, e5, and the bishop on c4, knight on f3. And our opponent's next move is to pin that knight with bishop g4. And in this situation, an important thing to note is that their king is castled and ours isn't. So in this situation in particular, a pawn storm is very strong. If we push h3, they drop back. You can then push g4, start kicking this bishop around, even push g5 if you like, kick the knight around, and really get this attack going on the king side. Black can get in a lot of trouble very quickly if you start pushing these pawns. If in this situation they actually decide they don't want to give up all that tempo with the kingside attack, they can instead trade the bishop for the knight. But the problem here is we now have the bishop pair. So strategically, that's a very solid advantage moving forward into the middle game. Now that you have a solid understanding of some of the techniques to punish this bishop move, let's jump into Magnus's game. He's up against the GM Wonderful Time. It's a bullet game, so we're going to see a few mistakes out of Magnus's opponent, but I think that makes it more relatable. You're going to see some mistakes you'll see at the beginner intermediate level, and we'll see exactly how Magnus punishes them. So he's up against the Scandinavian, which like I was mentioning is where this bishop pin is most annoying. So he takes, we get the queen recapture, knight c3, queen is kicked back. And then the small change than what we saw before was that Magnus likes to play d4 immediately. He's just delaying the knight coming out, just gaining space in the center, all principled stuff. And our opponent plays c6. The reason for this is when you do push a d pawn to d4, d5 can be strong in a lot of lines, especially if they bring their knight out too early to c6. So that's the reason behind the pawn move. Now Magnus develops his knight, and we get to see the pin. Now in this situation, Magnus likes to do the pawn storm. He will go h3. And the idea is that if black just retreats his bishop, you can then push g4, the bishop goes back, and then the knight jumps forward. So instead of like we saw earlier with the king already being castled and these pawns setting up an attack, in this situation you're gaining tempo, you're chasing after that bishop pair very aggressively. So in this situation, black decides he doesn't want to let Magnus push him around with the pawns, so instead he takes the knight immediately, Magnus recaptures, and already he has the bishop pair. So now we'll get to see exactly how he likes to convert this in the middle game. Our opponent just develops his knight normally. Magnus brings his bishop out to f4. I'm sure g5 would have been fine as well, but g4, a bit more central control from this bishop. Our opponent then pushes e6, opening up his own bishop, and Magnus decides the queenside castle, which I love to see because the Scandinavian players love to queenside castle and put so much pressure on you, so I will certainly be remembering this line to flip the scripts on them. So in this situation, Black then tries to trade off the bishop, neutralize that bishop pair advantage, and Magnus plays the move e5. So this sets up the problem with suddenly there's this pin on the queen, so Black can't recapture because when you take back, that pin is exposed and you'll win the knight. So this is where Magnus's opponent makes his first big mistake of the game. He's a bit sick of this pin because he really wants to trade off this bishop, so he moves the queen to c7, but he's forgotten about the pressure on this knight. So Magnus takes the knight, ruining the kingside structure, but worse, also grabbing a pawn, and suddenly Black is in a lot of trouble. So the first problem is this rook is under attack by the queen, so Black brings it to the open g-file. Now he has some compensation. This is obviously a very active rook, and it's putting some pressure on g2, which is going to make it a bit difficult for this bishop to maneuver. So Magnus then decides to centralize his knight, and he's looking for trades. We know how good Magnus is at endgames, and being up a pawn, just trading everything, going into a pawn-up endgame would be just what Magnus wants. So smartly, our opponent moves his bishop away, attacking the queen with tempo, and Magnus just drops his queen back, again offering a queen trade, looking for that endgame, and Black is still denying it. He gets his queen to this very active b6 square, maybe setting up some pressure on the queen side, looking for checkmate, being down that pawn. So what Magnus does is throws in this check on f6. It's a fork of the king and the rook, so Black is pretty much forced to trade. Magnus is getting towards that endgame that he's after. And now Black tries to continue the initiative, develops with tempo, Magnus is forced back, and then he puts his queen on a5, again threatening these pawns, but they're all one-move threats. So Magnus has a lot of moves here. He could move his king. He could actually just counterattack this pawn that's under attack, but instead he decides to push a3. Black's response, since this h-pawn is still under attack, is to push it to h4. The queen defends it horizontally. And now this is where everything falls apart really quickly for Black. So Magnus develops his bishop, attacking that pawn, and Black decides to try and get initiative to take that g2 pawn, but it's definitely a poison pawn in this situation. There's just a bit too much counterplay for White, and you can kind of see why. I mean, this rook is immediately a target if the bishop wanted to move. We also have the king still uncastled, so there's some back rank problems that they're going to have to deal with. So it's a little bit overzealous, and you'll see how quickly Magnus punishes this. So first off, he goes rook to g1. Again, it sets up this problem of this back rank square. Again, it would be so much better if Black was already castled in this situation. And Black makes a massive blunder here. He centralizes his queen, trying to defend his rook, trading on his own terms to try and control this g-file. Like we're talking about, this g8 square is a massive problem. But what he misses, and Magnus misses this as well, is that c4 attacks the queen, and the queen has no squares to go that would simultaneously defend this rook. So if Magnus found c4, game would have been over already. White would have just been up a rook. But instead, Magnus goes pawn hunting, just decides to take the free pawn. Black then moves his king closer to the g-file, getting rid of some of those problems with the g8 square. But then in this situation, Magnus decides to set up this checkmate threat, and Black just misses it. Trying to play too quickly in bullet, decides to try and trade on the back rank, and Magnus just wins by checkmate. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. It helps so much, and I'm trying to get to 1,000 subscribers. If you enjoyed this video, you'll probably enjoy Magnus taking on the fried liver. It's some great endgame technique, so click above me and check that video out.